When Project Blue Book officially shut down in January 1970, the United States Air Force insisted the story was over. The records, they said, were complete. Every report, every witness statement, every piece of evidence had been archived, boxed, labeled, and transferred for permanent storage. The case was closed. But the archivists who later opened those boxes discovered something strange. Entire folders were missing. Whole case numbers didn't exist. Page counts listed in internal indexes no longer matched the files that survived. Some documents were still warm with the scent of smoke, as if they had been rescued from a fire or pulled from one. Yet the Air Force maintained that nothing was missing. The truth was simpler and far more unsettling. Thousands of pages referenced in official logs were nowhere to be found. Case numbers appeared with no contents. Investigators saw references to sightings studied in depth, sightings important enough to warrant multiple follow-up reports, but the actual reports had vanished. And what remained was only the shadow of what had once been there. Blue Book had always been a strange project. On the surface, it was a public-facing research effort meant to reassure Americans that their government was taking UFO reports seriously. But internally, it served another purpose: to control the narrative, to filter the unexplained into categories that protected military secrecy. For years, the Air Force combed through sightings from pilots, radar operators, scientists, and civilians. Some cases were trivial, misidentified planets, balloons, aircraft, but others strained the limits of what Blue Book could comfortably explain. Objects tracked on multiple radars simultaneously. Metallic disks observed by fighter pilots at close range. Fast-moving lights performing maneuvers beyond known aircraft capabilities of the era. These cases weren't listed as insufficient data. They weren't labeled solved. They simply disappeared. As the project neared its end, officers assigned to the final archival cleanup noticed references to special handling files, documents routed outside standard channels, bypassing the clerks who prepared material for the National Archives. These files were designated for restricted review, sometimes by unnamed offices or individuals outside Blue Book's command structure. Witnesses remembered them as the missing cases. Officially, they never existed. What caught historians' attention decades later were the internal memos that survived by accident, carbon copies misplaced in other folders, duplicates that should have been shredded but weren't. These memos referred to sightings involving advanced propulsion behavior, electromagnetic interference with aircraft instruments, and encounters observed simultaneously by aircrews and ground stations. The descriptions were technical, clinical, but unmistakably serious. Even more concerning were the redactions that grew increasingly aggressive toward the end of the project. Pages were blackened almost entirely. Sometimes only a date or location remained. In some folders, even those were removed. What was left behind was a skeleton of the original record, a fragmented archive that hinted at something larger. Researchers looking through Blue Book storage boxes noticed patterns. Critical years were thinned out. Significant radar visual cases from Strategic Air Command bases were absent. Entire regional clusters of sightings, documented in newspaper archives, never appeared in Blue Book files at all. These weren't clerical oversights, they were selections. And the omissions clustered around the same categories: cases involving advanced craft descriptions, electromagnetic effects, nuclear-adjacent installations, and incidents witnessed by trained military observers. But the deeper researchers dug, the more they discovered another layer. Some missing files did exist once. They weren't mythical. They weren't rumors. A handful of them resurfaced through retired officers, declassified fragments, or leaks that emerged in the decades after Blue Book closed. These fragments proved something critical. The missing pages weren't blank reports or trivial recounts. They contained detailed analyses, diagrams, logs, and technical evaluations. Pieces of a story the public was never supposed to see. The real question wasn't why Blue Book shut down. It was why so much of what Blue Book collected was erased before anyone else could read it. And the answer began emerging from a trail of internal letters. Letters that survived only because someone filed them in the wrong drawer. The real unraveling began after the Air Force officially closed Project Blue Book in 1969. On paper, everything was wrapped up, archived, and boxed away. The project's leadership insisted that every file, every interview, and every piece of evidence had been accounted for. But as researchers began tracing the paper trail, something immediately felt wrong. The chain of custody for thousands of documents showed unexplained breaks. Requests for case files returned with notices claiming that records had been destroyed, even though no destruction orders existed. Other files had been inexplicably rerouted to storage facilities that didn't normally handle classified material. It became clear that someone had cleaned the shelves, but not cleanly enough to hide the gaps. Researchers who gained access to the remaining boxes quickly noticed patterns. Certain years had heavy documentation, while others were nearly empty. Entire clusters of sightings were missing, especially those involving military installations, radar confirmation, or civilian pilots with professional credibility. It was as if the project had been meticulously groomed to remove anything that could challenge the public conclusion that nothing extraordinary had ever been found. The remaining documents still reference cases that no longer existed, suggesting they had once been filed but were later removed. It was like reading a book with chapters torn out, whole sections missing, and placeholders left behind by mistake. The missing case numbers were the first real clue. Each Blue Book sighting was assigned a numerical code, and the surviving index cards listed hundreds of cases that should have been present. But when researchers asked to see the files, archivists consistently reported that they had no record of their whereabouts. They didn't know when the files disappeared, who pulled them, or whether they had ever been delivered to storage. Many of the archivists weren't even aware of the case numbers until investigators showed them the index lists. The Air Force Manual on Document Storage required destruction certificates whenever sensitive material was removed, yet for these files, there were none. It was an erasure with no fingerprints. As investigators expanded their search, they discovered something even stranger. Several cases referenced in the surviving documents included photographs, recordings, and physical materials listed as attachments. But when those attachments were requested, the Air Force responded that no such materials existed. In some instances, the attachments were described in enough detail that their absence made no sense. A few were described as metal fragments recovered from crash sites. Others included radar printouts from military tracking stations. Some referenced reel-to-reel tapes containing pilot commentary during encounters. Their disappearance created an obvious question. If the Air Force truly believed UFOs posed no threat or significance, why remove the physical evidence? The deeper the investigations went, the more inconsistencies emerged. Archivists found shipment logs suggesting that certain Blue Book boxes had been moved to different facilities shortly before the program ended, but those facilities denied ever receiving them. This created a maze of conflicting statements, misaligned records, and transportation tags without destinations. It was as if the files had been deliberately scattered, hidden, or absorbed into other classification systems. The truth became clear. Project Blue Book didn't end with a clean conclusion. It ended with a vanishing act. Freedom of Information Act requests started pouring in throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Many came back with lengthy delays or pages entirely withheld, not because the subject matter was considered dangerous, but because the documents supposedly did not exist. Yet other requests accidentally revealed internal memos referencing those same missing files. It was obvious the Air Force's inventory was incomplete, and the more citizens pushed, the more frustrated officials became. The public was being told that the files didn't exist, while other declassified documents proved they once had. The most disturbing revelations came from individuals who had worked in the Blue Book offices. Some recalled rooms filled with boxes that simply disappeared one day. Others remembered outside personnel, not part of the official staff, reviewing documents and removing certain cases. These individuals rarely provided names or specific agencies, but their descriptions matched patterns found in other Cold War programs. Intelligence officials stepping in when material was deemed too sensitive for public release. Whether these removals were routine, protective, or intentionally deceptive remained unclear, but their fingerprints were everywhere in the surviving record. One Air Force officer, speaking years after retirement, described a moment when several of the most controversial cases were collected by a team he didn't recognize. They weren't wearing Air Force uniforms, and they didn't sign in using the standard logbook. The files they carried out were heavily guarded, processed quietly, and never returned. The officer couldn't confirm where the documents went, but he noted that they were the ones Blue Book investigators had struggled with the most: sightings involving structured craft, electromagnetic interference, or detailed radar confirmation. These were the kinds of files that contradicted the official narrative. By the early 1990s, researchers analyzing the entire archive discovered yet another anomaly. Many surviving documents appeared to have been copied, not preserved. The ink quality, copier marks, and mismatched page margins suggested the originals had been removed and replaced with duplicates. Some had entire sections missing, stripped out before copying. While document copying was normal procedure, these inconsistencies hinted that someone had selected what portions were allowed to survive. Whole chains of correspondence had been trimmed down to short fragments, removing context, names, and conclusions. Instead of a complete historical record, Blue Book's archive looked like a curated display. Even more perplexing were the cases involving military pilots. The surviving summaries referenced incidents in which aircraft were forced to take evasive action, or where strange craft paced military jets for extended periods. Yet the full pilot reports were nowhere to be found. In one instance, a sighting described by a pilot as the most frightening moment of his career had been reduced to a two-sentence summary, stating the phenomenon was likely a weather balloon. But in the margin of a different document, the same case number included a handwritten note saying the pilot's testimony had been classified and stored separately. When investigators searched for that separate file, it was missing. The puzzle grew even more complicated with the discovery of destroyed correspondence. Some remaining papers mentioned attached letters, phone transcripts, or interoffice memos, but none were found. It became clear that not only were files missing, but many communication records had also vanished. This meant the public was only seeing the outcomes of investigations, not the debates, disagreements, or concerns expressed by Blue Book staff as they analyzed sightings. Without the internal dialogue, the official conclusions appeared clean and simple. But the hints left behind suggested the real discussions were far more heated, uncertain, and politically complicated. The more investigators pressed, the more the narrative shifted. It no longer appeared that Blue Book was a sincere attempt to study UFOs. Increasingly, it looked like a public-facing shield, a program designed to reassure the public while the most sensitive cases were rooted elsewhere. The pattern of missing files suggested two layers: an outer layer for public consumption and an inner channel feeding into classified intelligence programs. Blue Book had not failed. It had been hollowed out by design. Some researchers traced the missing cases to other Cold War intelligence initiatives. They found references to cross-agency cooperation involving NORAD, CIA analysis teams, and Special Air Force divisions that handled aerial anomalies. These programs often overlapped, and in many instances, Blue Book appeared to serve merely as an entry point. Once a case exhibited characteristics that exceeded simple explanations, it was quietly rerouted. That rerouting created the gaps in the archive, leaving behind only references or stripped-down copies. The deeper this pattern ran, the more impossible it became to view the missing files as clerical errors. There were too many, spread across too many categories, with consequences too significant. Whether the missing documents described experimental aircraft, unknown aerial technology, misidentified natural phenomena, or something genuinely unexplained, their removal reshaped the historical record. The surviving archive no longer represented Blue Book's full scope. It represented whatever someone wanted the public to see. By the time researchers finished comparing all known surviving materials to the historical indexes, more than 10,000 pages were unaccounted for. Some may have been lost through mismanagement. Others may have been destroyed, but a substantial portion appeared to have been intentionally withheld, relocated, or absorbed into other classified repositories. The truth about what Project Blue Book actually discovered remained incomplete, not because the answers were never found, but because someone had decided the public would not have access to them. The story of Project Blue Book's missing files moved into its most unsettling phase when researchers began comparing the incomplete archive with scattered documents released decades later through unrelated channels. These were materials the Air Force had not intended to connect with Blue Book, but subtle details revealed unmistakable overlaps. Case numbers that had supposedly never existed appeared in technical summaries from intelligence briefings. Radar logs that were not part of the official archive resurfaced in declassified defense communication reports. Intercept transcripts that had been declared lost were quietly released in unrelated FOIA batches. It was as if pieces of Blue Book had been scattered across the entire national security apparatus, hidden in plain sight, tucked into reports where few would ever think to look. Cross-referencing these fragments exposed something the public had never been told. Blue Book investigators had frequently clashed with other agencies. Whenever a case involved advanced technology, large military responses, or unknown craft tracked by radar, the investigation was often taken out of their hands. These cases were not dismissed, as the public had been led to believe. They were escalated into classified channels. The missing files reflected this system more than anything else. They were not simply gone. They had been absorbed by a structure far above the Blue Book office's authority. One of the most disturbing discoveries came from a set of technical intelligence documents released in the late 1990s. They described unidentified aerial events near nuclear weapon storage sites during the same years Blue Book was active. The documents acknowledged that these events triggered security alerts, interfered with communication systems, and caused responses by armed military personnel. Yet Blue Book's archive contained almost no mention of them. The only references appeared in case indexes listing numbers without accompanying files. This absence could not be explained by oversight. These incidents were among the most serious encounters of the era. Their removal from the archive pointed to a deliberate effort to separate them from the public-facing program entirely. Further analysis showed that Blue Book had been tasked with downplaying high-credibility sightings. Internal memos, released decades later, described a clear strategy: reduce the public's interest, avoid alarming the population, and present explanations whenever possible, even if they were speculative. The more damaging cases were rooted still higher. This dual system allowed the Air Force to maintain a calm public narrative, while intelligence agencies quietly compiled their own assessments. Blue Book was not a project of discovery, it was a firewall. As the Cold War deepened, the military's tolerance for uncertainty shrank even further. Technological superiority became the driving force of national security. Anything that appeared to challenge American air dominance, whether foreign or unknown, was immediately classified. This created a second layer of missing files, cases that had no UFO component at all, but were instead related to classified aircraft programs. Blue Book became a convenient place to hide sightings of early stealth technology, experimental drones, and high-altitude spy craft. When civilians or pilots reported strange objects, the Air Force needed a mechanism to deflect attention. Blue Book was that mechanism, absorbing public scrutiny while intelligence agencies refined technologies behind closed doors. Many of the missing cases likely fell into this category, removed not because they involved extraterrestrial craft, but because they inadvertently revealed classified military projects. Yet even after accounting for classified aircraft tests, there remained a disturbing portion of missing files that defied simple categorization. These were the cases involving craft performing maneuvers beyond known flight capabilities, objects accelerating abruptly without generating sonic booms, and incidents involving electromagnetic disruption. Blue Book investigators had occasionally mentioned these cases in surviving correspondence, describing them as particularly difficult to analyze. Many investigators believed these events warranted deeper scientific study, yet the material was taken from their hands. When the archive was eventually declassified, these cases were among the most conspicuously absent. The missing files were not just politically sensitive, they were scientifically disruptive. The trail of these cases eventually led to a broader pattern within the national security state. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, intelligence agencies increasingly compartmentalized information. Programs became specialized, hidden behind layers of classification, each containing only a portion of the full picture. Blue Book functioned at the lowest rung of this hierarchy. It was never given access to the full scope of information held by the intelligence community. Whenever an incident crossed into higher security thresholds, the file was pulled, reassigned, and often permanently removed from the Blue Book system. The public would hear nothing. Even Blue Book's own staff were frequently cut out. The missing files represented these hands that reached down from above, removing anything considered too sensitive for the project's official mandate. Researchers eventually uncovered references to parallel programs operating concurrently with Blue Book. Some focused on aerial surveillance. Others monitored foreign technology. Still others examined aerial phenomena that could not be explained through conventional means. These programs often intersected with Blue Book before reclaiming the most critical evidence. Their involvement became clearer with each fragment investigators recovered. Documents that shouldn't have been connected bore identical timestamps, identical case numbers, or matching descriptions. Though the Air Force continued to insist that Blue Book had been comprehensive, the surviving evidence painted a different picture. The project had served as a public-facing filter, not a complete investigative body. One pattern became impossible to ignore. Nearly all missing Blue Book files corresponded to cases in which multiple forms of evidence were reported simultaneously. Visual sightings corroborated by radar, pilot encounters supported by ground observers, objects seen by thousands during mass events. These multi-witness incidents carried too much weight to be easily dismissed. They could not be attributed to weather, balloons, or misidentifications without undermining the credibility of the institutions attempting to explain them away. Removing the files eliminated the problem entirely. With no public record, no questions could be asked. Yet despite the missing files, the remaining fragments revealed enough to undermine the official narrative. Even heavily censored documents contained slips, references to structured craft, technological characteristics, or military concern. Some reports described disciplined formations flying with intelligence or intent. Others mentioned craft hovering silently over restricted airspace. A few described objects accelerating instantly, behavior impossible for any known aircraft of the era. The fact that these references survived at all suggested that the censorship process had not been perfect. The same imperfections that left behind partial index numbers also preserved clues to what had been removed. The most pressing question remained. What was the motive behind such widespread removal? Some argued that the missing files protected classified aircraft projects. Others believed the files concealed intelligence about Soviet capabilities. A more controversial view suggested that certain cases involved phenomena the military did not understand and could not control. In the Cold War mindset, admitting ignorance was unacceptable. Eliminating the files was easier than explaining them. Still others believed the files were removed because they pointed to something extraordinary, something that would have upended the Air Force's public stance that UFOs posed no threat. Whatever the reason, the end result was the same. Project Blue Book became a fractured record of a fractured era, a picture with half its pieces missing. The surviving documents revealed a project constantly overshadowed by larger, more secretive forces. The missing files revealed the limits of transparency in a government built on compartmentalization. Blue Book's official conclusion, that there was nothing to see, collapsed the moment the gaps in the archive were exposed. By the time researchers finished reconstructing the timeline, the story had become clear. Project Blue Book had never been designed to answer the UFO question. It had been designed to manage it. Its public facade reassured citizens that nothing unusual was happening. Its missing files revealed the opposite, that something was happening, something serious enough to warrant thousands of pages being hidden, rerouted, or erased. In the end, Blue Book's greatest secret was not what it discovered, but what it concealed. The truth did not vanish because it was never found. It vanished because someone decided it should never be seen.